Now, Sarah and I are particularly grateful to Jenni Emery, who has joined us this morning. Jenni is the Global People Director at Arup, and she started that role at the beginning of the year. But before starting that role, she found the time to write a book. Jenni's going to talk to us about leading organisational change. So please do enjoy the session. And Jenni, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. And it's a real treat for me, actually, to have a chance to talk about my kind of favourite business topic, particularly at a time when I think the need for meaningful engagement and discussion around some of those topics has never felt more acute, actually. So we're going to talk about purpose at a time where you only need to kind of glance at the paper to suspect that collectively, the political establishment at least has lost all sense of theirs. We're going to talk about belonging when there are some fundamental questions that we're all asking for ourselves and our families and our communities and our organisations about identity and inclusion, and thinking about how we tackle some of the world's biggest challenges by really bringing people together and collaborating, and what does it mean to have people feel that they belong. And above all, we're going to talk about change. As Kate mentioned, there's lots of there's a book, and I'm going to talk about the book in due course, but there's also lots of real personal resonances for me in lots of what I'm going to talk about. I am the Global People Leader at Arup, and that's a new role for me, and so lots of very personal sort of searching in terms of my own purpose and my own career and lived experience of going through change and transition and what that means. But I've also joined an organisation, a couple of you who knew Arup were talking with me beforehand, which is deeply purpose-led, right? Almost exceptionally in the sector and amongst organisations, and thinking through the implications of that. And I've joined that organisation to make some really quite fundamental change and shift in that organisation. So the interplay about, what are we here to do? What is our purpose? And how does that show up in terms of how we might want to change an organisation is something that I'm kind of doing for a living all day, every day at the moment. Before I was at Arup, I've 20 years pretty much in and around law as a lawyer originally, and then in professional services firms. And most recently, I led the three-way merger of three law firms, CMS, Nabarro and Allswine, which went live back in May 2017. And the book was kind of inspired by that experience, by the fact that I didn't feel that I could find anything that I wanted to read about what we were trying to do and the implications and opportunities that had for people. Lots of really dull books about change tools and process, you can kind of take your pick. And then I was finding myself kind of right off in the self-help canon, reading stuff about individuals and then trying to triangulate that all back. So the book was very much kind of born out of a desire to bring a more human lens to all of that. So we're going to talk a little bit about change and my hopefully slightly subversive, countercultural perspective on change and what it means. I'm going to talk about the three preconditions that I think organisations need to have in place if they want to flourish during periods of change. And then we're going to talk about some of the value that I think can be realised if those preconditions are there, and the real sort of upside and opportunity that change itself can bring. And I'll kind of give you the whistle-stop tour of that, because I suspect there'll be bits that are more interesting and bits that are inevitably less interesting, and if we spend more time in discussion, we can kind of target it accordingly. The aim ultimately is just to have you all leaving back into the rain feeling a bit inspired and a bit empowered in a really practical way, to think about the changes that inevitably each of you is tackling in your own organisations or communities or personal lives, and just think about them a little bit differently and feel inspired to do things a little bit differently. So when I talk about change, I like to begin by talking about a book, but not my own book. It's a very different book. This is a book called Two Monsters by David McKee. It's a children's book. Some of you might have read it when you were children. I think it's been around forever. Some of you might have read it to your own children. It's about two monsters who live on opposite sides of a mountain, one on the east side and one on the west side. The two monsters have never met each other, but they speak to each other through a hole in the mountain. They can talk. And one evening, the sky is beautiful, a bit like this. And one monster shouts to the other through the hole, "Look, isn't it beautiful? Day is departing." "Day departing?" shouts the other monster. "You mean night arriving, you twit." And from there on, the whole thing goes downhill, literally and figuratively, and they throw longer and longer insults at each other, And then they begin to rip chunks off the mountain and lob them across the mountain at each other, and this continues all of the following day until, just in time for another sunset, there's no mountain left, just a pile of rubble. The two monsters meet face to face for the first time. And with a gasp, they both realise that the other was right. It is day departing, and it is night arriving. And they both sit down, have a lovely giggle together and watch the sun go down. Now, my children have all for a season loved that book, which is due in no small part to the insults, definitely. It's funny having your mummy call someone a soggy cornflake and worse. But I think that there's a kind of paradox at the heart of that story that ignites even small children's imagination, and it certainly ignites mine. And it strikes me as a really interesting illustration of change, actually, and our attitudes to change, and fundamentally of a choice that we have between two paradigms. So, and again, this is a choice that you will see being played out, I think, with a little bit of reflection in your own organisations, in the political arena, in families. Between the kind of traditional approach that says when you're faced with change, the thing to do is dig in and defend your own position and make some rules and policies and probably build a wall and cross your arms and be quite angry actually, and probably a little bit defensive and afraid. And if you're really forced to change, then let's just kind of keep our head down and get through this with as little kind of damage as possible. And our only ambition really is just to emerge at the other side relatively unscathed. I think pretty much the dominant paradigm. Or a different approach, which is maybe softer, a bit subtler, but no less powerful for that, which says when you're faced with change or something that you don't know about, the thing to do actually is to kind of step into that space and that uncertainty and admit that maybe you don't have all the answers, and see whether you can bring this view and this view together and create something new and different that neither of you might have thought of before, that might be untested, but that might even be better than where you started from. So that's one way that I think this story is illustrative, and that we might think about the choices that we've got playing out for us at the moment. But if there's a choice there between two paradigms, I think it's fair to say that there is also a real sort of paradox at the heart of how we talk about change and how we think about change, and that's real. So we talk on the one hand about how we live in VUCA times, proper macho acronym, things are volatile and uncertain and complex and ambiguous, and we venerate the leaders who embrace that and who innovate fast, and we hear that change is the new normal, going to happen twice a day, sunrise, sunset, for the rest of your lives, just need to get through it and embrace it. And yet, as soon as we start talking about change, the first sort of most used model that we go to is a grief curve, right? We talk about how terrible we all feel. Well, it's no wonder we all feel awful because it's change, isn't it? It's the grief curve. And so there is something odd going on there, and we do kind of then just kind of sort of hunker down into kind of survival mode. And there are good reasons for that. There'll be plenty of people in the room who understand enough of the neuroscience to know that when you're faced with something uncertain, your old lizard animal brain neuroamygdala makes no distinction between physical threats and social threats. It's as scary as being chased by a scary tiger, right? So it's proper. There are good reasons to be afraid when change happens and it's uncertain. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit more and what's going on there for people and how you can help to mitigate some of that. But ultimately, my thesis on change is basically almost sort of, yes, you twit. Yes, and. Change is scary and difficult and can be threatening, but it is also potentially a hugely good and productive period for people, and not just because of the promised sunny uplands that your change programme is ostensibly taking you towards, but because the change period itself can be value generating, instructive, a time where people can learn and grow and innovate and build new relationships with each other, and generally create value for themselves and for organisations and for communities. So that's my subversive thesis on change, that the change period itself is important, and we should pause in that kind of half-light, sunrise, sunset, dawn, dusk, and be willing to live in that uncertain, changing period and see what good can come out of it. So this is the because framework. So in the book, and my thesis says that the goodies that you can get out of change can be understood in an acronym, because every good business book has an acronym, right? And the acronym is because, which is also a word in itself, which reminds us that we're keeping this rooted in purpose. So I'm going to dig into that a little bit in terms of certainly telling you what the letters stand for a start, you're all figuring them out. But first of all, there are 3 key things I mentioned that I think need to be in place, in my experience, in an organisation before any of those goodies and value can start being unlocked and unleashed. And the first of these 3 key things is purpose. Now, if you're playing bullshit bingo, you can all mark your card, because purpose is the most overused business buzzword of the year, without a doubt. And being a lawyer, obviously by background, that sort of slightly casual use of a word without it being well defined made me a little bit suspicious. So in the book, I dug in a little bit into what we mean by purpose. Now, this is as highbrow as the presentation gets. I should say that I had pre-readers reading an early draft of my book, including quite a stringent academic who had been marking up my book in the guideline, in the margins all the way through. And then she got to this bit, and I was reading her markup in this bit in the book where I had outlined all the different definitions of purpose, and she hadn't marked it up at all. And I was like, this is the highbrow bit, she likes this bit. Until about 3 pages and I got to the end, and she had written, "Dear God, thank goodness this bit is over, I'd lost the will to live." Okay, so we'll keep this bit brief, right? Having built it up that well, I hope you're all going to listen to this bit. Some people, when they talk about purpose, are basically talking about a kind of corporate responsibility, social good view of purpose, which is to say that when I talk about an organisation having a purpose, I mean it must objectively be very visibly doing good in society, and that's what I mean. Moving along, I do see this on a bit of a spectrum. Increasingly, you hear people talking about purpose in terms of its capacity to generate long-term value for an organisation. So all the noise we've had in this past year or so with investors writing letters saying that investors now care about purpose, or having chairmen of Anglo-American or other big corporates talking about purpose in their shareholder meetings. This is where I think they're talking. They're talking about if we have maybe even where the corporate governance code is coming from, if we have a proper sense of our purpose as an organisation, that will ultimately create better long-term value for the organisation and for the communities in which they're doing business. It's not new, it's kind of the Quaker view of doing business kind of come round full circle. Then, sort of linked to that, there's the Simon Sinek view of the world. There's the start with why. If organisations do well, they'll be tough, they'll be resilient, they'll be better able to realise success. Close cousin of that long-term value idea, but it's a kind of strategic approach. Start with your why and then grow from there. And then there's another school of thought which is linked to that, which Frederick Laloux talks about in his book Reinventing Organisations, which more or less says, just as we as humans grow up and as we approach particular periods of our life, we naturally look for meaning and kind of consonance between what we believe and what we do. That's a natural stage that you would expect organisations to go through too. So that kind of inner rightness is what he talks about, and being purpose-led is an almost inevitable outcome as organisations mature and grow. Then there is a view which is so these last two are much more about the individual and the person. So there's lots and lots of good literature and really compelling sort of books and research around how we make people engage and encourage people to engage, and how if people have a sense of meaning in their work, all sorts of things happen in terms of their seeking systems and their brain being triggered, dopamine being released, people making discretionary effort, reaching out to others, collaborating more, and so on. So this school says purpose is something that you need in order to engage individuals and humans, and we all need it personally. And then that's kind of rounded out by the overall view, which says that meaningful work is good for us and good for our well-being, and people thrive and flourish when they have a sense of purpose in what they do. So that's all out there in the mix when we talk about purpose, and I think it's all there. I think there's a pretty sort of unifying definition of that. You can spend hours if you want to debating it, but ultimately yes, an individual's purpose can be pretty much anything, but there's good research that says that we all like putting our shoulder to the wheel in pursuit of something bigger than ourselves, that people will make choices against their own immediate happiness in pursuit of something bigger, that's what purpose ultimately is. If you've got organisations full of those people, you can see that a natural stage of organisational evolution would lead you to talking about purpose. You can see that that would be a central part of strategy per cynic. You can see that if you're doing that, you're creating long-term value for your organisation and for wider society. So you can be anywhere on this spectrum in terms of what you think of when you think about purpose, but I think it's all one thing. This is a nice definition from Harvard Business Review. When an authentic purpose permeates business strategy and decision making, the personal good and the collective good become one. So that's that whole kind of spectrum brought together. And this is a second one. Purpose answers the critical questions of who a business is and why it exists beyond making a profit. But to be more than just words, purpose must guide behaviour, influence strategy, transcend leaders, and endure. So I like that definition, partly also though, because that then begs a question about how do you get this then? What is purpose? Is it something that I can just as a leader kind of scribble down on the tube on the way in? And just decide, right, we've got a purpose everyone, I've figured it out over the weekend and here it is. No, unsurprisingly, that's not where I think you get purpose from. When we did the merger, in a way, a merger situation is a gift, right? Because in terms of establishing purpose for an organisation, because you get to start with almost with a blank sheet of paper in a way that organisations very rarely do. And because we had a very, very clear objective in bringing the organisations together, every organisation, all three firms approaching it with a slightly different perspective, but we all knew what we were doing and why, it was really easy to kind of uncover purpose and be surfacing that and talking about it as we built the new organisation. So it felt much more like something that was discovered and unearthed rather than imposed. If I compare and contrast Arup, the purpose has been there, I think, pretty much since the beginning, and it was in the founders and in how they structured the whole business, such that that now feels like a really kind of long-standing part of the DNA. Both of those are very different examples, but they feel similar in as much as purpose is something that's discovered, I think, that's already there, and the job of leaders is to unearth it and articulate it and put words around it and maybe sort of refine it and in the articulation, but it's not something to be kind of imposed from outside. This picture's here because one of the best definitions I think I ever heard of purpose was Sasha Romanovich, the former CEO at Grant Thornton, talking about the process of having established purpose in Grant Thornton. And she said it felt like that famous quote that when Michelangelo was asked how he had carved the statue of David, he said, "I saw an angel in the marble and carved until I set him free," which is just amazing. I think that's what we're doing in our organisations when we're looking for purpose. It's already there, and the job of leaders is to bring it out. So that's purpose. That's the first of the three conditions. You cannot do change well in an organisation unless you understand the purpose of the organisation and your purpose in effecting the change that you're effecting. What are you doing and why are you doing it? Second thing you need is really authentic, wholehearted, sleeves up, messy, vulnerable leadership in the mix. You can imagine writing a book in a law firm that the final draft was pretty painstakingly picked over by the senior leadership of the drafting by committee at scale on a book. And we had got to the point where we were collectively happy with absolutely everything in the book, except that in the book I talk about the importance of vulnerability in leaders, and they all absolutely hated that word. It's such anathema when we are so used, I think for all leaders, and maybe particularly in professional services or whatever else, but where the leadership paradigm is that you are the all-seeing, all-knowing eye, right? That you solve everything, that you know all the answers, that you can fix stuff, and vulnerability is the opposite of, in that worldview, of what leaders should be. So they were saying, well, can't you take that bit out? I was like, well, no, because I think it's important. That's what I do think, and there's a bit of an irony there, because I was writing about what I had seen work so successfully in our merger, and part of that was genuine vulnerability on the part of the leaders, which I was holding up as a good thing. Well, can't you use a different word? No, again, no, because the research, which is compelling, talks about vulnerability in leadership, which isn't, to be clear, woolliness, weakness, I don't know what I'm going to do, I'm going to run away. It's not fear, but it is about being able to say, I don't know all of the answers to this. Now, there are two reasons that vulnerability in particular, as well as all the broader stuff I'm advocating around just being human and authentic and real. First is the compelling body of research that shows that leaders who demonstrate vulnerability are leaders people want to follow. They're seen as inspirational and strong and inspiring. So they do engender trust and action in the people who they are leading. And the second, perhaps obvious point is, if you create space, it gives other people who might know more about this than you the chance to fill it, right? So by saying, we've got this challenge here, I know that ultimately as a leader, and this is where I am providing the vision and the clarity that leaders should, that we're aiming to get over there, but I'm not crystal clear actually on there's a number of options here on how we should do this. What do you guys think? I'm sure there were lots of ideas in the room. What do you think? By doing that, you're giving people who are probably much closer to the coalface than you are, with much more, coverage of the detail, the opportunity to step in and to help. So in change, when inevitably there's uncertainty and stuff is happening that you can't predict, you cannot possibly cling to this leadership paradigm which says that you know the answers to everything. You don't. So being able to be vulnerable and to give people space. If the first precondition is purpose and the second precondition is having really authentic leaders, the third condition I think you need in your organisation are stories, and people who can tell them and find them and share them in the organisation. This is not a storytelling workshop, perhaps sadly, that's another kind of thing of the moment. There's a stat that says that you're 22 times, no idea how they measure this, you're 22 times more likely to remember a story than a series of facts. David Rock, the neuroscientist, deeply unromantically calls stories insight delivery devices. But because in the brain a story works differently to a set of facts, so you have to trigger all different parts of your brain. You're holding plot and narrative, you're holding different perspectives and motivations, so the whole thing becomes much more complicated, and as a result you're working that much harder, you're able to empathise, see different worldviews, and it's better for your memory. And that works even with lawyers in my experience. So 3 preconditions: stories, purpose, human leaders, and stories. I'm going to tell you in a minute what I think you can realise by way of value and upside if you have those 3 preconditions in place. But before we do that, I thought by way of illustrative example, I would tell you a cracking good story about a very authentic, wholehearted, vulnerable leader with a very clear sense of purpose. This is Frankie. Frankie is one of my daughters. She's 10 years old, but this story takes place a couple of years ago, back in March 2017. At this point, actually still, but at that point in particular, Frankie's she's as Celtic in nature as she is in appearance, right? So she's always got a cause, she's very passionate, and she at this point was particularly concerned about homelessness in our part of North London. And she had got to know the people who were sleeping rough near our house. She knew their dogs and the names of their dogs. She'd sit on the pavement and have a chat when we were out at the weekend. And she had written to the Prime Minister. She's written so many letters to the Prime Minister, right, that there's a file. But she had written to the Prime Minister basically saying what she thought needed to be done about homelessness. But meanwhile, she thought that she would take some action and try to raise some money. So she had decided that we would have a cake sale at school. It's one of those working parent things. You're like, yeah, great. Let's do a cake sale. So, early mornings before work in school, late evenings, we were baking for a few weeks prior, tray bakes, sponge cakes, biscuits, you name it. And we'd fill the freezer with cakes ready for the cake sale. The date had been set for Friday, the 2nd of March, 2017. So on Thursday, the 1st of March, we got all the things out of the freezer. We'd iced everything. Everything was in Tupperware by the front door. We were ready to go. But on the evening of Thursday, the 1st of March, 2017, something else was all ready to go. You're nodding. The beast from the east. the worst blizzard to ever beset London fell on the evening of Thursday the 1st of March. So Friday the 2nd of March, every school in London closed. Every school child in London absolutely cock-a-hoop with delight, except Frankie, who was absolutely distraught, like lying on the bed, tears, levels of distraught. And then she got up, because she knew that what she was trying to do was raise money for homeless people and for their dogs. And actually, probably this was even more terrible for them than it was for her. And where were they? And were they outside sleeping with their dogs and so on? And we had a snow day cake sale. So we live on a main road just opposite a green, which is great for snowball fights. So felt tip pens, A4 paper, snow day cake sale across the front window. We dragged an old gate leg table into the front garden and a little brazier around from the back garden to try and get some heat going, and we put the word out on social media, and she recruited her reluctant siblings into helping her, and we put a big tub of hot chocolate on the stove, and then we stood out in our front garden yelling "Snow Day Cake Sale" to anybody who was daft enough to come within 100 yards of us. And people would come over and we'd whip off a cloth, big fat snowflakes settling on the buttercream, and we'd ask them what they wanted and we'd stick it in a bag and off they would go. She made over £500 selling cake in our front garden for homeless charity because people were so generous, right? So she, by her own, reluctant admission later on that day, had the best day of her life. The obvious delight on the faces of people who had come to the cake stall was just, mind-blowing. And she made lots and lots of money for a really good cause. So a really silly example, largely to illustrate the power of storytelling, right? Because if you remember nothing else of breakfast this morning, I bet you'll remember the two monsters, and I bet you'll remember Frankie. But also to show that with a really deep, clear purpose, you can be very, very fluid in where you get to and in terms of your outcome if you're willing to kind of show up and engage as a leader. So I said let's unpack the because framework. So the B, as I've indicated a bit before, and probably most importantly, stands for belonging. Think about the opportunity that you have when things are changing to build or increase a sense of belonging in your organisation. Now, this will vary hugely according to what the particular change context you're wrestling with is, but in any scenario, it's deeply important. The stat that I just find mind-blowing, and so come back to again and again and again, which is that there is the single biggest predictor of longevity, actual longevity and health, is how connected we feel to one another. More than, knock yourself out. Smoking, drinking, eating, whatever you eat, whether you exercise or not, yes, but nothing matters more to us as people than whether we feel that we are connected and we belong. Broadly, three buckets that I think about when I think about belonging. One is the very physical environment that we're in and how that can make us feel that we belong. Think about your walk to work and how that feels just part of your routine. Think about, I remember my very first job when I was a trainee at Linklaters, being absolutely seduced by the smell of coffee on the client floor and the sound that my feet made walking along the corridor, and thinking, if I ever get tired of this, then I'll know that I don't belong here anymore. So there's some really sort of physical sides sometimes. And when we did the merger, one of the very small things we did was that made sure that everybody was within a line of sight in the office of somebody that they knew. Just a really small thing that sort of helped make a difference and made people feel that they belonged. The other two are relationships. Now, you might be in an organisation like Arup, where everybody has known, or certainly the senior people have known each other for 30 years, and that brings some challenges around how you integrate new people into that. Or you might be in a merger situation where really nobody knows anybody, and we ended up doing almost a huge kind of spider diagram of, right, this person needs to meet the following 10 people, this person needs to meet the following, but really being quite intentional in a change process around what you need to do to ensure that the right relationships are in place. And then the third element, linked to relationships but quite different, is identity. What tribe do people feel that they belong to here? Are you trying to reinforce a tribe that they're already in, slightly shift that? We talk, that experience of being new. I've visited tons of Arup offices globally, and that sort of sense check of how come it still feels like Arup? What is it? What does it mean to, without trying to create clones, what is it that makes this feel Arup enough that whether I'm in Shenzhen or Berlin or Chicago, it still feels like Arup. And what do you want? You want people to feel that they're part of that global organisation? That's quite hard to do when we know that people form tribes of about 100. Do you want them to feel that they belong to a particular office or practice group or team? How do you layer different senses of identity in, and how might that help? And you can see that purpose has a big role to play here, as do stories, and as inevitably do leaders in inculcating a sense of belonging. So that's the first one. The next one is evolution. The point here is a little bit what we touched on earlier, that you can be in a change process crystal clear about the outcome, but that you can afford to be, if you've got a really clear sense of purpose and strong leaders and great stories, really, really relaxed about how you get there. You know, this is an opportunity to kind of harness the expertise of the people who are in the room, who are best placed to make decisions in the moment. It's an opportunity to build goodwill by not going too hard and fast on some issues and going harder on others, and so on. And if I firmly believe that an evolutionary approach to change, rather than if you look back at some of the older change literature, you know, you would be forgiven for thinking that you can plan everything in advance on a Gantt chart and then it will just magically happen, is the right way to go. And I think that's enabled by having this sense of purpose and great leadership and great stories in your organisation. Now, I threw this slide up last week. This is the classic image for evolution, right? It's caterpillar, something in a cocoon, chrysalis, butterfly. And then somebody a few months ago challenged me to think about, like, what do you think is actually going on in there? And I had never thought about it. Like, did I think of like a tiny caterpillar gradually growing like really small wings and then them getting bigger and bigger? Like, I hadn't imagined it. And they referred me to an article in American Scientist, which basically describes the caterpillar produces an enzyme which more or less causes it to digest itself, right? It's a horrible, mushy mess in there. So I had fallen more in love with this hackneyed old image as a metaphor for evolution, because it's, and that's a significant period of the caterpillar's life cycle, right? So for large periods, stuff is messy and difficult, and we have to be able to get comfortable with that and live with it. And it also means that you can't stop halfway. You haven't got like half a butterfly, you've just got a big mushy mess. But then last week when I presented this and shared that insight, somebody also then furthered my knowledge by telling me that there are little things called imaginal cells, which have all the DNA information of the butterfly already in there, and that is what the rest of the stuff ends up kind of basically coalescing around and forming and becoming the butterfly. So the name imaginal cells is so amazing. And that, for me, the imaginal cells in the change process is the purpose, right? And the stories. And if you get those in place, you can start to craft and create everything else around them. So this metaphor keeps getting better and better. If you want to add a further scientific detail to my rudimentary understanding of butterflies, please do. C is confidence. Change can be, you know, the petri dish in which confidence can be destroyed so easily. Particularly sort of that fundamental, when we're working in the merger, people who feel that they've built their entire kind of career and standing and people know who they are, that real sense of kind of purpose in individuals can be really, really threatened when you start to change things around them. So we turned that on its head and actively looked for ways to build both individual and corporate confidence throughout that whole change process that we embarked on at CMS. And it reminded me of hill walking as a child, where, you know, every Scottish upbringing, right? Everybody piles into the Sierra and drives to the Highlands at the weekends, and off you go up a mountain. Me and my siblings all looking as if we were near death, until you're about 50 yards from the top and you see a cairn and there's an opportunity to find a stone and race to be the first one to put the stone on the top, and then it all changes. But cairns are built as wayfinders and are particularly useful when you don't know where you're going, right? So we thought about cairns and how you could just give people little examples of, you know, confidence. You know, this is what you did in your past. We've seen that. We know that you're great at this. This is what this whole organisation that's now being merged into the new firm stands for and has done and has achieved, and let's celebrate that. So at first, in the merger scenario, which is obviously just one kind of change, very much sort of backward looking. But then as soon as we could, shamelessly celebrating. You know, we won our first client jointly. Let's celebrate that. We've had, you know, 100 days together. They emails work, you know, whatever else. We all know how to find each other on the floors. Whatever we could find to kind of build our collective confidence and begin telling stories, we used. And again, purpose, stories, leaders, all absolutely fundamental to building the confidence in an organisation. The A is agility, which is slightly different from evolution. Evolution is kind of the means by which I think change can be done well. Agility is the fact that we all now know that our organisations are meant to be kind of redesigned and hardwired for agility. So the point here more is, as you're changing anyway, think about how you can hardwire, if that's not a contradiction in terms, agility into the organisation. Talk about agility and think often of like break dancers or ballet dancers, and where's physical agility most demonstrated in our world. And ballet dancers, gymnasts have a really, really, really strong spine, which on the one hand keeps them strong and on the other hand enables everything else to move very flexibly. And that for me is the purpose in your organisation. That's unwavering. You're crystal clear what your purpose is and you don't move from that, but it enables you to be deeply flexible in how you do everything else. The U is understanding. I suspect a lot of you will empathise with the notion that communication feels like the hardest bit of any change programme. You get sort of 50% of the people who say, well, I don't know anything, no one's telling me anything, what's going on, why am I not know what? And then 50% of people who will say, my inbox is full, why do you stop inundating me with stuff? I don't have, you know, and I still don't have time to read any of this, I still have no idea what's going on. So we spent a lot of time thinking about how to engender understanding, half of which is about clarity, choosing what you communicate and when and who communicates it, and whether you can put a bit of a narrative arc around things so it doesn't look like just one missive after another. But communication isn't just about clarity, it's also about enlightenment, right? And a meeting of minds, which is why this is U for understanding and not C for communication. Thinking about how you can encourage people to hear one another's stories, to understand one another's perspective, to truly come together to create something new. And again, a huge opportunity that change period brings to go deeper into that and to engender a new level of understanding between people in your organisation. The S is for simplicity. Just shedding stuff. I think, I said at the beginning, the temptation when change and uncertainty happens is to put more stuff in. Let's have some rules. Oh God, that can't happen. We need a policy. Let's have a committee. That's the Arup special, right? We've got so many because we're very consensual and nobody wants to be seen to be kind of taking a decision at anybody else's expense. We make committees for every decision, in lieu of largely any decision. You don't need to. If you've got, again, that clear sense of purpose running through an organisation, if everybody in your organisation knows what they're here to do, and understands that through the stories that surround them and have, and been empowered by leaders, you can trust people to make decisions in the moment that are in the best interests of the firm. It makes me think there's a town called Drachten in the Netherlands, which I talk about in the book, which for the last 20 years has been the subject of an experiment, maybe it's still a pilot, but it's 20 years old, by a traffic planner called Monderman, who took away all the road markings and all the traffic lights and all the roundabouts. Have you seen this place? So there's a whole town with no markings on the roads, with the result that he massively decreased the number of accidents and fatalities and everything else. And he said he was inspired by watching ice skaters and how they managed to avoid each other. And his whole philosophy is, it's dangerous because it's meant to be, right? And what he believes he has done is restore kind of agency and proper grown-up responsibility and awareness to drivers, because they're there they have to make decisions. They're not just mindless monkeys following the markings on the road. That's a bit what I think, we talk a lot about how, the new model is really flat structures and devolved power. How can you do that in an organisation, especially when things are changing, without utter chaos descending? You can, I think, if you've got a really clear sense of purpose, because people understand what they're here to do and how everything fits together, and then you can empower the person on the coalface who's best placed to make the decision, to crack on and make the decision without having to kind of come up through the hierarchy with XYZ form to ABC committee. So the S is for simplicity. in all sorts of ways. And finally, the E is for energy. And again, this was quite a surprising observation to me initially, but having seen it, I see it again and again and again, which is, again, we talk about resilience. So we regard change as a period where potentially people's energy will be sapped, where it's difficult, and that's true. And we talk about whether we can just kind of equip people well enough to kind of survive. And I wrote this chapter of the book when I was on holiday in the rain in Cornwall, watching rain sweeping across the beach and up to the house that we had rented. And all the plants in the garden, right, were resilient plants. They'd been planted by a gardener who knew that if you're on the coast and you've got winds and salt and rain battering your garden, you need to have plants who can withstand that. That's one kind of energy. But barely visible through the mist on the other side of the bay, there was a wind farm. What the wind farm was doing was not just surviving the storm, it was harnessing the energy in the wind and using it to create electricity. And that is my ambition for what we can do during change. Not just have people kind of survive it and be okay, but actively harness the energy. And the way I think this shows up is that it's almost like you've created a sense of momentum in your organisation, that people understand, oh, this change thing, I can do this, we're doing things differently, that's refreshing, that's new, I feel quite good about that. Well, while we're at it, let's fix this other thing. We ended up on the merger doing all sorts of side projects that we didn't have in the plan, that we thought would be a bit much for people at day one, because there was this kind of groundswell of change ability and appetite to do things and to do things differently. And again, I think that is unleashed by great leaders who are really clear about the purpose of the change and make people feel confident and empowered to make that change well. So there you go. That's belonging, evolution, confidence, agility, understanding, simplicity and energy, which together are because. And that is pretty much all I wanted to say. Save that to bring all that round, I hope what that makes you feel is that you have more capacity to influence both the outcome but also the lived experience of people in your organisation through change than you perhaps realise. There's only a few ingredients, and they can be, it's not like there's a big manual on how to deliver purpose or how to tell good stories or how to be a decent leader. You can read whatever you like, but by virtue of doing that and thinking in really practical ways about how you can build belonging or how you can make things simpler for people or how you can find a way to build somebody's confidence and celebrate things, you really can make this a valuable period for people. So in conclusion, be brave in the face of change. Aspire to do more than just survive, and dare to believe that you can be like the two monsters. Put down your rocks and sit in the half-light of change, giggling a bit and quite enjoying it. That is all. Thank you very much.